Welcome to this video on Brown v. Board of Education, a landmark Supreme Court case from Topeka, Kansas in 1954. The Brown v. Board case consolidated 5 distinct cases, including ones from Kansas, Virginia, South Carolina, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. Oliver Brown was the lead plaintiff in the case, representing himself and 12 other families who sought access to local neighborhood public schools. The core legal question was whether segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The legality of segregation was the central issue for the Supreme Court. Arguments against segregation maintained that it violated the Equal Protection Clause and that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. Segregation was also argued to cause psychological damage to Black children and harm America's global image. Thurgood Marshall's legal strategy focused on intangible equality and included psychological evidence of harm. The core goal was to directly challenge and overturn Plessy v. Ferguson. The Clark-Dall studies, led by Dr. Kenneth Clark, demonstrated that segregation caused significant psychological damage to children and fostered internalized inferiority among Black children. Dr. Kenneth Clark's Dall studies provided crucial evidence that segregation harmed children's development and caused significant psychological damage. The U.S. Justice Department filed an amicus brief arguing that segregation was harmful to America's global image. The Cold War context emphasized the urgency of challenging segregation. The government's amicus brief highlighted segregation's harm to America's global image during the Cold War. It argued that segregation undermined U.S. leadership against communism. The U.S. Justice Department's amicus brief argued that segregation hurt America's global standing and undermined its leadership against communism. This Cold War context elevated the importance of the case. Education groups like the AAUP and NEA filed amicus briefs strongly supporting desegregation. These briefs emphasized academic freedom and the importance of equal opportunity. The AAUP brief focused on academic freedom arguments and strongly supported desegregation in public schools. This showed significant educational backing for the Brown case. The NEA's Equal Opportunity brief supported desegregation in all public schools, emphasizing equal opportunity for students. This educational support was important for the Brown v. Board case. The government of Liberia also filed an amicus brief, arguing that segregation harmed America's image during the Cold War and supported desegregation in American schools. The ACLU filed an important amicus brief arguing against the constitutionality of school segregation. They maintained that segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause and supported the unanimous decision in Brown. The NAACP filed a crucial amicus brief in support of desegregation. This brief argued against school segregation's constitutionality and was part of Thurgood Marshall's legal strategy. Segregationists relied on the separate but equal doctrine and argued for states' rights in education. The established precedent was Plessy v. Ferguson, and they claimed segregation caused no harm to Black students. Segregationist amicus briefs supported school segregation, relying on the separate but equal doctrine. They defended states' rights to control education and argued segregation was not harmful. State amicus briefs, like Virginia's, opposed desegregation. They argued for states' rights over public education, relying on, separate but equal, and claiming no harm to Black children. Virginia's amicus brief opposed desegregation, arguing for states' rights to control public education. They relied on, separate but equal, and claimed school segregation did not harm Black children. Segregationists strongly relied on states' rights to control education, citing the 10th Amendment to defend public school segregation laws. They asserted complete control over local public school education. The Southern Educational Association filed an amicus brief opposing desegregation. It supported states' rights to control education and defended school segregation. The White Citizens Council supported segregation in an amicus brief, defending states' rights to control education. They argued that separate but equal was constitutional. The central constitutional argument against segregation was that it violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. The legality of segregation in public schools was the core issue for the Supreme Court. The American Farm Bureau Federation filed an amicus brief supporting desegregation in American public schools, showing support for the final decision in Brown v. Board. The Topeka School Board argued that segregation was a states' rights issue, relying on the separate but equal doctrine and Plessy v. Ferguson. Segregationists used the 10th Amendment and the separate but equal doctrine from Plessy to defend state control over local public school education. The school board claimed that segregation was a states' rights issue, asserting state control of student education. They relied on, quote, separate but equal, and argued against any harm to students. Segregationists asserted states' control over local public education via the 10th Amendment, defending public school segregation laws and arguing against federal overreach. Segregationists primarily relied on the 10th Amendment, supporting state control over education. The separate but equal doctrine from Plessy v. Ferguson served as the legal basis for upholding segregation. The segregationist argument relied on the, quote, separate but equal doctrine established by Plessy v. Ferguson. They asserted states' rights over education and claimed segregation did not harm black students. Chief Justice Earl Warren guided the court, ensuring unanimity and focusing on moral clarity to establish a strong legal precedent in the case. The Supreme Court delivered a unanimous 9-0 decision in 1954, ruling state-sponsored school segregation unconstitutional. This overturned Plessy v. Ferguson, determining separate facilities are inherently unequal. The Supreme Court deliberated for over a year, requiring re-argument to address key constitutional questions. Chief Justice Warren guided the court toward a unanimous decision to ensure a lasting legal precedent. The Supreme Court addressed implementation by issuing the, quote, Brown II ruling the following year, ordering desegregation to proceed with all deliberate speed. Brown v. Board established a critical precedent for civil rights, fueling the broader movement. The ruling mandated an end to state-sponsored segregation and directly challenged separate but equal. The Little Rock Nine crisis began in 1957 when Governor Orval Faubus blocked 9 African-American students from entering Central High. President Eisenhower deployed federal troops to enforce integration. President Eisenhower deployed federal troops to Little Rock to ensure the safe entry of the Little Rock Nine. This action countered the Arkansas governor and enforced the school integration order. The Little Rock Nine crisis set a precedent for federal enforcement of court-ordered desegregation in schools, demonstrating strong resistance but becoming a defining moment for the civil rights movement. Brown v. Board established a critical legal precedent, directly challenging, quote, separate but equal. Federal action was required to enforce desegregation, despite massive resistance from southern states. Despite Brown v. Board, persistent segregation remains a challenge today. Diversity has decreased, and racial disparities in discipline and funding gaps between segregated schools continue to exist. Modern segregation trends include persistent segregation and decreased diversity in public schools. Racial disparities and funding gaps between diverse and segregated schools remain ongoing issues. The future of school equity still grapples with persistent segregation and racial disparities in practices like school discipline. Diversity has decreased, and funding gaps between segregated schools continue to be a concern. Key takeaways from Brown v. Board include overturning, quote, separate but equal, setting a critical civil rights precedent, mandating an end to state-sponsored school segregation, and demonstrating the necessity of federal enforcement.